G'day everyone and welcome to Pellowe Talk. It's fantastic to have you joining us today, either live or delayed, watching this later. Today we're having a panel discussion about everything coronavirus. We're not going to be talking up hype or how bad things are, but we're trying to have a sober look and maybe ask some questions that a few people are starting to ask. And joining me on the panel, we have Steve Kilah, Graham Young and Lyle Shelton. So thank you for joining me, gentlemen. Welcome to Pellowe Talk.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.
So, Graham, why don't you start? Let me ask the question, and we're just going to all jump in and have a fairly casual conversation. But what do you think about the limitations that are in place in various states at the moment? I think New South Wales is a lot more tighter, and Victoria. All of us are in Queensland, for those of you joining in, and we're still allowed some degree of freedom in our life here. Graham, have we gone too far for too long, or is this all completely justified for as long as it takes?
Well, I guess what you've got to do in this situation is balance out two things which you can never really know. One is how many people are likely to die as a result of the coronavirus, particularly if your health system gets overrun. And then on the other hand, what damage you do to people in their lives if they can't do business with each other and can't interact with each other. So I think most of us were quite happy in the first place, while the government got a handle on things, to have things screwed down pretty tightly. I understand the coronavirus is a lot easier to catch than most viruses. So you get a spike in the number of cases much earlier on, and therefore the potential for the hospital system to be overloaded. However, what we've seen in Australia is that we've got on top of the increase in cases to the extent that there's absolutely no threat to our ICUs at the moment. And therefore I think there's a case for things to be eased off. And I think that case is furthered by the realisation that the major strategy that the government appears to be running on is that the idea of herd immunity, that if enough of us catch it and get an immunity to it, it will ultimately die out. So what they're trying to engineer is a controlled explosion. And what I'm a bit worried about, looking at the numbers, is that we've got a damp squib rather than a double bunger at the moment. And that's not going to actually achieve their aims in any reasonable time span. And that's going to end up being an unreasonable restriction on people. For example, the Queensland Premier is talking about 6 months. I think most people would regard that as being absolutely ludicrous. And I think there'd be a lot of people in fear of their lives from their stir-crazy partners and kids running around for that period of time, only being able to meet up like this.
Yep. Now, Alexander Downer this morning made a comment on Twitter, and he said, "We either save avoidable deaths and destroy society, or accept avoidable deaths and save society." The moral dilemma of our time. Lyle, what do you think is the pathway through this moral dilemma? Are there any guiding principles that that we could apply to solve the dilemma?
Yeah, it's a wicked policy problem for governments all around the world. We're seeing the crematoriums in New York working overtime, Italy and Spain, refrigerated trucks outside of hospitals. It truly is horrific. And so this is what we've got to weigh up. If we continue to allow the virus to go unchecked and the deaths escalate, that's obviously terrible. And just because people are old doesn't mean their lives are not important. People in their 70s and 80s, still could have many, many years of life and of joy with their grandchildren and their children. So we must preserve their lives. But then we've got to weigh up the damage done to the economy and the likely suicides that would occur as a result of people being hopeless, as a result of unemployment. So these are very real social impacts as well. There's not an easy answer to the question. There has to be a pro-life answer to the question, whichever tack we take. But I agree with Graham. We can't let this lockdown keep going for another 6 months. I think we'll bankrupt the nation and we'll send the economy over a cliff. And I think the signs are encouraging that we are flattening the curve. I think now we've got to find a way to exit this and find a way to protect vulnerable Australians, particularly the elderly and the frail. Maybe the next phase of the lockdown has got to go towards protecting those people and letting the rest of us get back to some sort of normal life.
Could I just jump in there?
Yeah.
The use of the word economy concerns me a little bit, because you get people juxtaposing and creating a dichotomy where you've got people, humans on one side, and this impersonal thing called the economy on the other side. When in fact, really, the economy is just another way of viewing people's interactions, which are social as well as commercial. So it's not, it's not something inhuman versus something human.
I agree.
How long can we stand this sort of isolation, and is it actually good for us? Because the economy is a lot more than just money. It's people socialising, it's people working together, it's people achieving things together.
Yeah, and Graham, that's why I tie the economy to hope, and why it's dangerous if economic activity ceases, people lose jobs and businesses. That will result in mental health issues, in suicide and further deaths. So, look, I'm in total agreement with you.
Your thoughts on the moral dilemma?
Sorry, Dave.
Your thoughts on the moral dilemma? Save avoidable deaths, prevent avoidable deaths, and ruin society, or face avoidable deaths and save society. What are your thoughts on what we've just said recently?
Yeah, I think my thoughts go towards how things are important versus things that are not important. Right now, a fantastic man that I went to school with all those years ago is Professor David Patterson, who's trying to find a vaccine. And in all the conversations that the community is having in all different levels, the thing that I'm wanting to hear more of is the race to develop the vaccine. And we have some brilliant Australian scientists and researchers. And I think for the first time in my lifetime, a scientist, a researcher is now being championed over a basketball player or a tennis player or a popular musician, because funnily enough, it matters right now not to have how many clicks or likes on Facebook, but to find for all of the world's community a vaccine. And probably this is a real wake-up call to community about what's really important. And I think what Graham and Lyle have talked about there about our communities, what an economy actually means. It's about a human person dealing and having relationships with other human people. And I'm really pleased that maybe we're having a bit of a stop and a think and a do about what's critical. But I'd like to see more community discussion around our scientists and doctors and researchers as they plough into an unknown field of trying to develop a vaccine. The vaccine is what will set this community, Australia and the rest of the world, ultimately free. Without that vaccine, without championing medical research, then we will be constrained for a long time with some type of constraint before we can go back to being the community that we've always probably just taken for granted.
Now, I'm just trying to share a window for everyone with something exactly that Graham was just talking about. So here we go. Figured it out. Graham, this is something Sally McManus said recently. She's obviously the lead union person in Australia, and she's the secretary of the Australian Council of Trade Unions. It says there on her Twitter profile, helpfully for me right now. But you're talking about economy not being a warm enough word, and that is a sentiment that is echoed by people like Sally McManus, who says you're either caring for people or the economy, as if the two are mutually exclusive. She tweeted out at the end of March, "We have a global experiment happening regarding COVID-19. What is the better way to save lives and jobs? A, Trump, money for business, keep as much open as possible, put the economy first. Or B, Ardern, guarantee workers' wages, shut down the country." So it seems like the proposition from her is the two are mutually exclusive, looking after people and looking after the economy.
Well, it's the economy that ultimately looks after people. And there's a great site called Our World in Data. I don't know whether you've all been to it, but it's well worth going to. They've got some great graphs on COVID-19 at the moment, but they've also got some great graphs which show how good things got during the 20th century and the early 21st. And there is a clear correlation between length of life, healthiness of life, decrease in wars, etc., with the increase in wealth that there's been in the society. So the economy, and a good economy and an improving economy, is not something that's divorced from all the goods in the community. It's something that actually equals them. You know, you can have an average, the average lifespan of a person dying of COVID-19 in Italy at the moment is 80. I checked, the average lifespan in Italy is 83.4 years. Now, 20, 30 years ago, they wouldn't have even been alive today. A lot of them probably wouldn't be alive without the wealth that provides them with advanced medical care. They wouldn't be alive without wealth that provides the education, that provides the people who are looking for vaccines, etc. People in their lives. They're a sum game. In fact, it's incredibly ignorant to claim that somehow the economy has nothing to do with these things. It's got everything to do.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. Any further thoughts on that, Steve, Lyle?
While Steve's just gathering his thoughts, David, it's really bothered me during this period to see people who don't seem to understand why the economy is necessary in the way it's just described, thinking that somehow this season of government largesse to keep things going could become the new normal. I mean, we've got Get Up, the left-wing activist organisation, which is really, you know, a front for the Greens and Labor, out there saying that this free childcare, wage subsidies, you know, minimum sort of living wage, all these policies that have been championed by the extreme left of politics, they want this to be the new normal, as if you don't have to pay for it from somewhere, as if a $1 trillion public debt, which is where we're now heading as a result of the measures that have been taken by Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg, are taking us, and as if that $1 trillion, you know, doesn't have to be paid back and we can keep living like this forever. I mean, Get Up are quite brazen about this. I tweeted about it, and they tweeted back yesterday saying, Lyle, you understand what we're actually up to. I mean, they don't try and hide the fact. It's extraordinary. And unless we can snap back out of this, to use the Prime Minister's words, and I'm glad he's trying to prepare people for the fact that we have to come out of this, we won't be able to get back to where Graham rightly says we need to be, and that is in a wealth-generating scenario where people are trading goods and services, where there's normalcy returned, so that wealth can build back again. And I'm very worried that the longer this goes on, the more damage that's going to be done to our ability to create wealth, and also our ability to service debt going back into the long term. Access Economics, Deloitte Access Economics at the weekend said it could take 36 years to pay back the debt that we have now accrued just as a result of the decisions that have been made in the past couple of weeks. That's absolutely frightening, and that's something which I think most Australians don't grasp yet.
Yeah, look, my youngest is 15 years old. In 35 years, he's going to be 50 and have his own children. This could be a debt that my grandchildren are having to repay. And anybody that's older than me, that's a certainty that our grandchildren are going to be paying this debt. So let's go to the question then. What exactly are we doing to save the economy right now? And I want to turn to the question of all the stimulus packages that are going on. Reportedly, what is it? Is it a trillion? No, $1 billion. We'll get the numbers right in a second. But the point is, there's a heck of a lot of money being put into the economy. Now, let's talk about a definition for those people who have no idea what quantitative easing is, and what mixture of quantitative easing and debt is being used, and any other strategies. Where is the money coming from? Steve, any thoughts from you? Why don't you start with a layman's definition of what quantitative easing is?
Yeah. All right. So there's two situations here. The orthodoxy of how we've dealt with money, most of our lives and most of the viewers' lives, is money has always had a price, interest rates. As we move towards this thing called QE, quantitative easing, money is basically now not having a price. So you look at the RBA, its official interest rate is 0.25. So the cost of money is a quarter of 1%. And as the RBA moves towards zero, you now have the situation where money doesn't have a price. So once they've used up that ammunition, which has always been interest rates, and if you watched it historically, they've been coming down. I think Lyle and Graham, you remember the years of 20%, 19%. But that was the price of money.
22.5%, I think, was the top I borrowed at.
Yeah. Now it's coming down to near zero. So now money doesn't have a price. So now what do the RBA, the Fed of America, and the Bank of England, they now move towards their new policy weapon, which is quantitative easing. So basically now what we're having is there's only one way to legally print money, and there's only one entity in Australia that's allowed to legally print money, and that's the Reserve Bank of Australia. And the Reserve Bank of Australia is the bank to all the banks that the community knows, ANZ, Westpac, Mutual, MBE, you name it. The RBA sits on top of the banks and is the bank to the banks. But it's the only one that's allowed legally to print money, just like in the United States, the Federal Treasury is the only one that's allowed to print money. So now we're going to have this enormous printing of money, and we're going to have the issuance of government bonds. So I'd ask all the viewers out there, if you want to know how much debt Australia currently has as a country, as its citizens, go to the website www.aofm.gov.au, and you will see Australia's debt today stands at around about $583.2 billion. Now, the stimulus packages that have been announced by the Treasury are now going to add that onto that figure. We will issue government bonds. The RBA will send the money out to the banks. The banks will then, thanks Dave, that's it. The banks will then lend that money out by issuance of lending to the community, which is the stimulus that they're trying to now undertake with this flooding of money into the community. The issue that is always of intrigue here is that the banks could keep that money partially on their balance sheets as they see impaired loans coming across their own desks. So if you have part of the community that's suffering critically from being able to pay things back, then the banks won't have an impaired balance sheet if they decide to keep some of that money on their own balance sheets, which they could technically do. So you're not going to see the banks lose here, which is another point that you might want to take up later, David. But quantitative easing is simply just getting more money out, circulating through the economy. It's underwritten by the issuance of bonds. It's primarily printed money from your ultimate bank, the Reserve Bank of Australia from Australia, or if you're in America, the Federal Treasury, or if you're in the United Kingdom, the Bank of England.
Any,
Graham? Can I ask a question of Steve, just coming out of that excellent analysis he's just given us?
Yep.
As a non-economist, I'm intrigued as to if the Reserve Bank is into quantitative easing to put this money into the economy, how do we pay that back? Do we pay that back to the Reserve? What's the process for that? And sort of a second question is, with government bonds, what's the breakup roughly between government bonds that we're issuing, which is effectively borrowed money internationally, and quantitative easing? So there's two questions there.
Yeah. I'll go to the second question. The second question is the one that I'm very intrigued by, Lyle, is to know what's the proportion of the government versus, say, pension funds or the banks themselves having the money through. I personally am waiting to see how that's going to unfold. As to paying it back, I think you've hit the $64 question?
$64 million question.
Well, in this case,
probably billion these days.
Trillion.
I can only say from a personal point of view, it's got me intrigued about, I know the mechanisms are all there, but I am worried about the mechanisms being able to cope with this, because I think David was just saying we're looking at a 36-year payback. When you look at our current AOFM figures, what mechanisms or what policies in place to actually pay that back? Now, I was writing about the AOFM debt when it was $250 billion, and I was told by many other people, don't worry about it. And then it's now got to 583, and it's now projecting towards 1 trillion. And I personally always think, well, we've all got children. People watching here have got children. We've got young viewers who are 20, 25, 18, and they might be asking, well, hang on, how does this affect me? We all know there's no free lunch, and everyone who follows the football, the cricket, the netball, we're not mugs, us Aussies. When you want to get colloquial and right down to tin tacks, we're not mugs. There's no free lunch. We've always told each other there's no free lunch. How do we get this paid back? Well, there's another Australian saying too, we're all going to have to take a haircut. Now, what does that haircut look like? That's another policy question that needs to be asked of our 150 members of the House of Representatives and the Treasury Department officials that sit behind them. You could do lots of things, and there's a myriad of things, but I would have a feeling that there might be a push now to have a bigger population of Australia, therefore dilute.
Sounds like we might be losing you, Steve. The internet's dropping out and your picture's frozen. Graham, you got any further information you can share on your understanding of quantitative easing versus government bonds?
I think Steve did a very detailed rundown there. There's been quantitative easing going on now for a fair while in some countries, not in Australia. I think if you want to look at the future, Japan's a good place to start, because they've been doing these sorts of things now for 25 years. And what you end up with in Japan is a whole lot of more or less zombie companies. I think one of the explanations for low world growth in the last decade or two, certainly since the GFC, has been that instead of letting businesses fail, some businesses, not all businesses, but some businesses fail, we've been trying to prop the system up so that no player loses. And the result of that is that there's a lot of bad players left on the board, and those bad players dilute the good players. Worse than that, in a properly functioning system, the good players get to buy up the bad players and take their assets and deploy them properly. Now, we haven't been doing that. I think the government's approach to this COVID-19 situation is going to exacerbate that problem, and we run the risk that it's going to be cemented in as future policy. You just simply can't run any sort of organisation on the basis that everyone wins. Everyone can't win, just by definition. They've tried it was tried in Nazi Germany, or the Weimar Republic rather, and that's what gave rise to Nazi Germany. The way Hitler got them out of the problem was basically expanding the German nation, empire building, and the military sinews and so on that went to do that. He pulled unemployed people off the streets. He stabilised the economy. Now, we don't want to get into that sort of situation, but there's a story that says that we might well, or at least someone might, not necessarily Australia. You don't need Australia to do it. In fact, if Australia did it, it wouldn't be a big problem because we're such a small part of the world economy. But if a large player like Europe or America or China went down that path, then we could all have a problem. And that kind of takes you back, in a sense, to the life issue. What I'm seeing in this debate is people saying the most important thing in life is your life. And we're now moving into a season, in a religious sense, where we celebrate the death of a man who said it doesn't profit you anything if you keep your life and lose the world. And I think that's something that's worth thinking about in this situation, that risk is something which is inherent to everything, and that there are some things that are more important than having a long life. And our parents and grandparents certainly understood that. My father worked his guts out and possibly shortened his life. He had a pretty long life, but maybe he could have lived longer if he hadn't worked so hard. And his parents the same. People went to war to maintain an economy and put their lives on on the line. And what we're doing at the moment is saying, oh, no, we can't risk anything. No one can lose. And in the process of that, we could be in the process of losing a lot of what we work for. Not necessarily everything, but a lot of what we work for.
Mm. Just to be accurate, I think the quote was actually the other way around, where Jesus said, "What does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul?" It's in Mark chapter 8. But it's a point very well made. Despite there being probably other quotes which support it very well. Look, do either of you know the answer to this question, which is there a simple balance sheet that the average person can see the income and outgoings of government receipts as well as where our money is being spent?
Yeah. The budget papers. That's pretty easy.
Is there a website where that's
there's a pie chart
dated and easily accessible?
Sorry, yeah, just Google Australian federal budget. And there's a number of budget papers. They'll have the glossy. You don't really want to rely too much on the glossy, but as Lyle was saying, they've got pie charts and things like that which show you where expenditure is. But when you get into the other budget papers, numbers 2 to whatever, they'll give you comparisons. And there's also the mid-year economic MyEFO. Anyway, whatever MyEFO stands for, but there's a mid-year economic statement. And they also do budgets against actuals in some of the documentation.
Yep. So here's a good question. When we talk about the generated debt, who is the money owed to?
Well, this is the question that I was hoping Steve might have been able to answer, and Graham may well know the answer.
Trying to come back to us. We'll bring him in as soon as he connects.
I'll have a quick punt. My understanding is government bonds that are issued would be predominantly bought by the likes of China. So that would bother me in the first instance, and possibly Middle Eastern countries where they have a strong oil industry like Saudi Arabia. It's a mystery to me, and this is where I was trying to get Steve's perspective earlier on who pays back the money that the Reserve Bank prints through quantitative easing.
Yeah, look, the Reserve Bank buys some of the bonds as well. I mean, you're right, there's a bond market. I wouldn't worry too much about the Chinese. The Chinese economy is still smaller than the US economy. So as a percentage of investment in the world, it's, I think them owning strategic assets is one thing. Them owning our bonds is an entirely different issue. How the quantitative easing is paid back, in theory, is the bank issues money and buys assets with it. So it's got a debt which is met by a corresponding asset. So they net out to zero. Does that make sense? So as long as they can sell those assets for what they paid for them or more, then they're ahead. The problem is that they bid up the price of these assets because they put more buyers, them being the extra buyer, into the system, which creates more competition. So that pushes the price of the assets up. However, when they go in the other direction, if they sell, there'll be more sellers than buyers, which should theoretically push the price of the asset down. So there's got to be a problem at the end of the day when they try and push the assets out. And it is make-believe money. It doesn't exist in the first place.
Graham, any answer to this question? When has anyone else outside of the RBA been able to print money in Australian history?
Probably before we were a federation, but I'd have to take that on notice. Generally speaking, money was tied to, before the 70s, was tied to the price of gold. So the government guaranteed that it would redeem a dollar for a set amount of gold. This fiddling around with money first started in the 18th century when the French used it. A Scottish guy came up with the idea, and Scotland was a big centre of banking back then, and it was in its early days. Now, he came up with the idea that this fiat money, you could print as much as you liked. Well, the the end of that story was that the French went broke and they ended up having to sell Louisiana to the Americans at a bargain price just to try and get back on their feet. So these kinds of boondoggles have been going on for centuries, and people keep, it's a pea and thimble trick, or going to the casino and thinking you can beat the system. People just keep buying into it, and you get people invested in telling other people that it's a good deal. And at the end of the day, a reckoning comes, and suddenly a whole lot of people lose their assets.
So what do you think about this comment? Welcome back, Steve. Son of Ang on YouTube says, let some businesses fail. This is the Hayekian approach. Very, very necessary. Real life has consequences. The alternative being Keynes, everyone must win. No good.
Go on, Steve, you have a go. I've been monopolising the economics while you've been away.
We've got your microphone all garbled, Steve. You might have to get your tech person back in. All right, we'll come back to that question. So let me see who else can.
That question echoes what I was saying before.
Yep.
Except I'd attribute the idea first to Schumpeter, but the idea of creative destruction. And I'm speaking as someone who's actually had a couple of businesses that haven't done that well. So I've never thought anyone ought to come in and rescue me because a particular idea didn't pan out. At the end of the day, that was my risk for my profit.
Yeah. And what do you think about the concept of too big to fail? So I've had a couple of businesses as well, and you learn something each time around. But can Australia afford for Virgin or Qantas or another major corporation in Australia to fail? Is there such a thing as too big to fail? Steve, can we hear you? No, it still sounds like Mickey Mouse on helium.
The too big to fail issue, I think it's wrong with probably one caveat. The banking system needs to be stable because people need to have faith that if they put their money in somewhere, they can get it out. So I'm reasonably tolerant to people interfering with the banking system to provide that stability, but no more. And one of my regrets out of the GFC was that none of those banking executives got the sack. A number of them should have.
Yeah, that's right.
This concern about Virgin, they will either be able to recapitalise, or if they can't recapitalise, buy their plane fleet, a plane, and be extraordinarily well positioned to take Qantas on. We'll have a very efficient plane system, airline system going. There's going to be far more planes around than anyone can use in the near future. Whatever happens domestically, the international side of air travel is going to be severely dented. It's going to be harder to go travelling. You might have to go into quarantine if you want to go into certain countries, or come back into your own. So that's going to be depressed for a fair while unless you get a vaccine or something like that. Domestic will come back faster, which means there'll be a hell of a lot of planes out there that no one wants to fly. So you'll be able to buy plane fleets very cheaply. Virgin's got some to, if not Virgin, someone else in the space that they have at the various terminals, etc. So I don't think there's any risk that they're going to disappear or that the second airline will disappear. I think what you're seeing there is some fairly sophisticated big investors, most of them being overseas companies, because if you look at Virgin's share register, it's mostly overseas airlines that owns it.
Yep. Even
though you can buy shares on the Australian Stock Exchange. And they're just trying to milk the Australian taxpayer. And I don't want a bar of that. If you pay money to anyone in the current situation, it's someone who's lost their job and doesn't have any surplus asset to back themselves up while we get things back and running, not Qatar Airlines or whoever the shareholders are, or Singapore Airlines, the shareholders in Virgin.
Yeah, I think I agree with Graham. I think people forget that it was less than 10 years ago that Alan Joyce was walking the halls of Parliament House in Canberra trying to get big licks of taxpayers' money for Qantas to prop it up just after he became CEO. And I think it was the then Abbott government who rebuffed him and said, no, go away. And then I guess through a combination of good luck through low fuel prices, perhaps some good management, Qantas got back into profitability in spite of everything that Alan Joyce was saying at the time when he was looking for a taxpayer handout. So I think there's a strong argument for not putting the taxpayer on the line for the likes of Qantas and Virgin at a time like this. And I think any measures that are taken, as the government's trying to do at the moment, must be short-term and not be seen as a way to prop up failing airlines. I remember when Ansett collapsed, as I'm sure Graham and Steve do, and it caused some major disruption, but very soon the market recovered, Virgin came in, and we had competition back in the market, and I think that'll happen again should Virgin fall over in the middle of this crisis.
Most definitely. Can I hear me now, Dave?
Yep, you're sounding good. We had Son of Ang thank Mickey Mouse for appearing on Channel 4 a moment ago. So,
if we're talking about Virgin Australia and Qantas, let's really call out a few spades here. Lyle's spot on about the Qantas chairman going back several years ago asking for some money and being rebuffed. But we're talking about a $1.4 billion capital injection, which the major four owners out of memory are Etihad, UAE government, Sir Richard Branson's Virgin Group, HNA, and Singapore Airlines. So if you amortise that over the four, we're only looking at 350 million Australian dollars each, and they've got their capital. And it's a great trick. It's a great attempt to ask for $1.4 billion, and hats off to them. They're giving it a go. Now, is it hats off to us to say yes or no? We'll let the government on our behalf decide, but we'll make our own representations. But let's also have a look at drilling down right onto what's at risk or what's to be gained. Sydney-Melbourne is the third most travelled aviation route in the entire world. Hard to believe. It's hard to believe, but we have the third busiest travel route in the entire aviation passenger world, Sydney-Melbourne. And that's what they are all fighting. It's their rivers of gold. So everyone's going to be in it to get it. Now, I agree with what Graham was saying. Of course, we're going to have a lot of cheap aircraft lying around if all things fall over. And someone will come in because the lucrative market is always going to be. Australians are well cashed up in good times. This will pass. I'm very confident and will come back. And we will travel again. I don't know when. That's the crystal ball. But when we do, we will travel. We have David, your children, who are young enough to understand how great it would be to travel, and they want to travel. We've got people at the other end of the spectrum, the retirees who work their whole life, who want to travel. We have young Australians, aspirational, who want to be educated, learn overseas, be wherever it is, in Saudi Arabia, London, Canada, Pakistan, India, etc. We have people travelling for all different reasons, and they will travel again. It will travel again. Who will be our provider? It'll be Qantas, and if those four shareholders decide to capitalise themselves, it'll be Virgin. Now, I'll take a personal point here. I really take my hat off to another tourism aviation person, Graham Turner, Brisbane man, veterinarian by trade, who is the CEO of Flight Centre. Graham, who I do not know, has not gone to the Prime Minister asking for money. He's gone back to the capital markets and asked for an injection of between 500 million and 700 million from new money. He has not gone cap in hand asking to be saved. He's gone to the markets because he's confident in his product. I'd want to know why those four shareholders aren't confident in their product, that they have to actually go to the government, e.g. the taxpayer. Why don't they go back to their own monies? Because surely they're confident in their own product. Graham's confident in his product, and all his 6,800 staff have been unfortunately laid off. He's confident in his people. He's confident in what he sells. He's confident that there's a demand for the product that he's offering. And I would have thought that Virgin should have confidence in its amazing staff, everybody, and the product it's got, to be not asking for capital and asking for those four investors that I've named to stump up their money? Do they not believe in their own investment they've made so far? Do they not believe in their rate of return they're going to get over the foreseeable 20 to 50 years? That's the question I'll be posing to those four entities.
Let's turn to a little bit of geopolitics. And we've got comment from Chris Griffiths that China and India are two elephants in the global room. We cannot ignore the two biggest populations, which highlights the challenge of understanding the pros and cons. Son of Ang says India and China. India is a flawed capitalist democracy, but the CCP is a mafioso dictatorship. Big difference. And the conversation goes on. China's achievements are undeniable, but they must progress to better governance. What are the thoughts of China and India, the global economy, in this all?
Well, I think we've got to have a really hard look at our relationship with the Communist Party in China. I think many of us over the last 3 decades have been lulled into a false sense of security that perhaps China had entered a post-communist era. They had opened up their markets, become a capitalist society. Essentially, we've seen their economic growth produce a miracle of lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty at breakneck speed, never before seen in the history of the world. That's been a good thing. It's only really in the last probably few years that we've realised, hang on, these guys are still Stalinists, and that's starting to come home in spades and into the popular consciousness, I think, for the first time in the midst of this crisis, where we've seen the Communist Party cover up the emergence of the virus in Wuhan. A doctor is missing, and I'm going to say her name wrong, a female doctor is missing. The other ophthalmologist who blew the whistle, he was demonised by the party and has since died. We've seen an incredible reliance on supply chains in China for essential drugs and other goods. And I think we're suddenly realising we're dealing with not nice people in this country, not the people themselves, but the governing cabal in Beijing. And I think that's a massive wake-up call to Australia and the world. And I think as we emerge from this crisis, we've got to rethink our relationship with China and their desire to exercise geopolitical control around the globe. They've been doing it by infiltrating our universities here in Australia through Confucius Institutes. They've infiltrated, arguably, the New South Wales Labor Party in very unhealthy ways, a la Sam Dastyari, etc. So I think we've got to be more assertive. Yes, we want to trade with them. Yes, we want to have an economic relationship that benefits both countries, but that must not come at the expense of kowtowing to what is essentially, using their own words, Xi Jinping's own words, a Stalinist regime.
Yep. So,
some opportunity there, Dave.
Say again, Steve?
Can I take some opportunity to discuss those things there?
Yeah, jump in.
Thanks, Mark. So, Lyle, we'll address this issue about supply chain logistics, of course, which is very topical across most press at the moment. I was talking with David earlier today, and we were just talking about some things. But we have net winners, net losers in this. There's always going to be winners, always going to be a loser. So I think the Western nations particularly have woken up to the fact that their supply chain logistical occurrences have seen them have 95% of their pharmaceutical products supplied by one particular country into the West. Now, I've heard the word mentioned many times in the last 72 hours about decoupling. So I think what I'm very interested to watch is how America decouples or attempts to in its political environment potentially how it will embark on maybe a decoupling process. My observation, whether I'm right or wrong, time will only tell, but I see Mexico as being an enormous potential winner of this pandemic. Close proximity to the United States can take off some of the supply side constraints, particularly with its pharmaceuticals. I think the major pressing issue at the moment around the world is PPE equipment, masks, and drugs, ventilators, all the things that we thought we had, but we just simply don't have in the necessary quantities that we, particularly Australia, would like to have right now. So I think you'll see opportunities across the Asia Pacific also for Thailand, Indonesia, emerging democratic country, Laos, Cambodia, to jump in and become potential supply chain providers to the West, as we call it. I think India will also have a marvellous opportunity to offer a strategic competitive advantage in being able to supply products to many markets across the world. I think Mexico, being so closely proximate to America, is also going to be very much in their favour. They'll be reliable, they'll be extremely efficient, they have a low cost base for wages, and they'll be right there on the border that can have immediate access if anything was to go wrong again, particularly if we were to have coronavirus 2 or 3 or 4, then we wouldn't have this total reliance on particularly one supply chain. I think the supply chain is something that's going to be addressed across many countries. And I think it's going to present opportunities for some at the expense of the demise of others. And I'll let people figure out who will be the winners and who will be the losers potentially out of this necessary conversation that I think many Western health departments are having right now. I think the Australian saying is they're being caught with their pants down would be a complete understatement. And at the moment, we need supply chain certainty at sensible costings where we don't have countries bidding against each other, states within America bidding against each other, etc., etc. And we'll have to wait to see how this potential problem could actually now become a work-through solution going through into the 20s, the 30s, the 40s and the 50s for the benefit of all of Australian citizens.
So what I'm interested in... Sorry, Graham, go ahead. Thank you.
I think in some respects, and this is going to sound a little bit awful, but the virus situation's been fortuitous. The situation with China has been obvious to people who pay attention to it for some time. It's, I think, the first mercantilist economy that we've seen in probably over a century. And I think Donald Trump actually was onto it before most world leaders, and that trade war that he was waging with them, the war part of it was possibly more important than the trade part of it. It wasn't just about selling goods, it was about potential domination of the US by someone else. Australia has a history of sailing into wars underprepared. World War I, it didn't matter that much because it wasn't happening around here, but World War II, it did. We weren't well prepared for it. So these sort of security issues that we're now starting to think about, you know, how do we support our own health services if we can't manufacture PPE, for example, are things that we will now be thinking about. We'll also probably do something about the security of our fuel supplies. You know, we've got a dodgy solution to having the reserves there. We count reserves that we could get from the US and other places as being part of our reserves, while they're not. So, you know, I think those sorts of things are being rethought. We've had too much of a reliance on China. And, you know, when you think about our trade relationship with China, it was very slight before the GFC. One of the things that rescued us from the GFC was that particularly our mineral exporters pivoted and they started exporting to China when, in fact, they were doing very little before. But we've now got an over-reliance there. So we've, and it's not just with minerals, but it's where we get our goods from. Fortunately, the Chinese have been outsourcing a lot of their manufacturing as well. So it's not as though they're the only place you can get these things manufactured. You know, Steve was talking about Mexico, but there's a lot of countries closer to us than China: Vietnam, Cambodia, Indonesia, India. Although one of the interesting things to watch will be what this disease does to some of those countries which have less developed infrastructure than we do. And you may find that India and Indonesia, for example, come out of this a lot worse than they went in. So that's just something to watch. But
that's very true.
I think China's done itself a lot of damage by the way it's handled this, and it's flagged to the rest of the world that, hang on, these people are not reliable, and it's flagged in a way that things like Tiananmen Square didn't, because Tiananmen Square, dreadful as it was, didn't happen to us, whereas this is happening to us, and our kids be telling their grandkids about the lockdown that Australia went through. It'll be like the Great Depression in terms of our folk memory.
Any thoughts that you want to add to that, Lyle?
Look, I think I agree with everything that's been said. I think we've got to turn our minds to also how much strategic Chinese investment there is in this nation. We've already leased the port of Darwin for 99 years to a communist regime. We've got communist-backed companies here, and let's not beat around the bush. Companies that operate in Australia that are Chinese-owned are subservient to the Communist Party to the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. That is a fact. They do their bidding, and we saw this with two Chinese companies that went around buying up PPE equipment and supplies from Australia and shipping that back in aircraft to China just before the crisis broke here in Australia. Now, these were property companies who changed their business model to go and buy up, hand sanitizer and masks from Australia and send it back to Wuhan. Now, this is scary stuff. This is how the Chinese operate. I think we've got to think very carefully about selling any more prime grazing properties to Chinese interests, to selling stations like Cubby Station, water rights, etc. All of these things where there's vertical integration, dairy companies and the like. So, yes, let's have investment, but let's think long and hard about ownership of assets. And I think this is where the Foreign Investment Review Board has got to, take a good hard look at itself. It's been a joke in the eyes of most Australians for forever. Yep. I know the government's tightened up recently in this crisis period, but I think coming out of this, we've got to take a long, hard look about Chinese ownership of Australian assets because they are a communist Stalinist regime, different to American or British ownership. They're democratic countries, but I think in terms of Chinese, things have got to change.
So when this is all finished, when we're out of lockdown and it's business as usual, back to normal, how do you think the Australian government should be officially postured towards China? Should we be doing as much business with them? Should we be encouraging as much tourism and foreign students in our universities? Should we be looking actively for alternative people to do business with as a nation and as individual citizens collectively?
I don't think it's up to the government to decide those sorts of things, but because it can't. It can't tell business. It's not like the Chinese. That's our advantage, but in terms of that, it's our disadvantage. But you'd have to be pretty dumb if you're running a big company, and I don't exclude the possibility that it's possible to be pretty dumb and run a big company. It's happened. But you'd have to be pretty dumb not to see the writing on the wall in this situation and say, we need to diversify.
I think, Graham, yes. But I also think on top of that and in conjunction with that, maybe this is a time where Australia finds its confidence in who it wants to be. We're 24 million amazing people sitting on top of an amazing island full of everything you can imagine. We have no national sovereign wealth fund like the Norwegians do. We are an abundant nation, but we don't have much in terms of money in the bank to show for it, which might be a philosophical thing that can be talked about later. But we sit on every single resource you can imagine. I dread to think how we could go on all day and night about the physical minerals we sit on, intelligent people. And I think everyone wants us to be a wealthy country, not in terms of money only, but compassion, inclusiveness, and all those things that we talk about. I'm concerned that we don't have a confidence in ourselves to be a super country within the Asia Pacific, and yet we could be, but we have to choose to be. Lyle, I think you were bringing up earlier today in one of our discussions about nuclear and the nuclear submarines, between the development of a $50 billion purchase of French submarines and why don't we go for nuclear? I would have thought in this particular time, as we write out checks that are pretty large, that we'd want to get a lot of bang for our buck. One of the things I'm interested in is, why wouldn't we have nuclear submarines? Because A, they're extremely good for the environment and they protect our citizens. Isn't it odd, funny, whatever word you want to use, that the EU now has gone back to having its own nations? It's now trying to solve coronavirus in its own nations. I noticed that the chair of the EU banking system's now finally come out to say it'll lend money intra-Europe, but all of a sudden we've got France, we've got Italy, we've got words that have got singular things and not Europe. They're all scrambling to save their own people. So when it comes down to the real crunch, they're in it for themselves. And when it's not crunch time, they have this populist notion of a la Europe. So I think, Graham, you're right there. We have opportunities everywhere. We need to step up and see where we see ourselves in the Asia Pacific. And we don't need to dominate people, but we need to be intelligent of how we use our country's assets. I'm also very concerned about our Indigenous populations and how their health is going with COVID-19. Because when I look at the Keeling Islands, the Tiwi Islands, Christmas Islands, Thursday Islands, our Indigenous remote communities, it's really critical. It's really critical that these people, the Indigenous Australians, have every access to health that we do in Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, Perth, etc. Because I'm really concerned for them. I don't see much media being discussed about it. Maybe, hopefully, we don't have a lot to report, but God forbid if it got into those Indigenous communities, how they would be able to be looked after, because it'd be a real, real worry. I'm concerned for our three northern neighbours. I wrote this in an article the other day. I'm concerned for Indonesia. It's got the highest rate of healthline practitioners dying per COVID. I'm worried for Papua New Guinea. Goodness forbid if COVID-19 took great stranglehold in PNG. And I'm also very concerned for our very impoverished nation, Timor-Leste, or East Timor, who we helped out considerably. So we've got internally our own Indigenous people I'm very concerned for, and for the three neighbouring nations I'm very concerned for as well.
Let's have a chat about ending this. The economy obviously can't stop forever, because it will create so much poverty that the health system will be incredibly burdened and incredibly under-resourced. And obviously the health that we enjoy in this nation is a direct byproduct of the prosperity we enjoy in this nation, which comes from the economy. How do we get out of this cycle? Has anybody heard any announcement from any politician about the triggers, the metrics, at what particular point in the things that we are measuring will they permit us to go back to work? And what will that look like? Will it be life as it was in January, or will there be a gradual relaxing of movement and association, physical distances, etc.? Any thoughts on how we get out of this, and when, and any of those questions I just raised?
Yes, David, it comes down to the scientists. Clearly, simply, it's the vaccine. Once we get the vaccine,
I've heard comments that the vaccine's at least 12, maybe 18 months away. So yes, clearly we're not going to stay at this level of lockdown for a year, let alone 6 months. There's heaps of people who are going to be just popularly defying all these restrictions.
And that's the observation we're going to have to watch unfold before us. I note today, and I made a comment and posted something about the Italian industrial machinery / industry is now advocating very strongly to the Italian government that they just cannot simply sustain any more closures of the Italian manufacturing industry, because the population is just desperately unable to sustain itself from an economic point of view. And that's very strongly been sent to the Italian government from the Italian industry peak body. We are seeing splinters of commentary being made about this is not economically sustainable. It is a real race to develop this vaccine. The vaccine is the solution to everything, but we can't do 12 months. We can't do 18 months unless there's a freeze, unless we stop everything in terms of our finances. As a major shareholder in a bank, it probably goes against the grain. and as an investor, I'm quite prepared not to receive a dividend from the bank. I've had plenty of companies in my lifetime do what they call virtual signalling. And that's cool. That's their prerogative.
We've seen years, decades of virtue signalling from the banks.
As a shareholder in a bank and how I make some money to live on, I'm willing not to get any dividend payment from the bank for as long as this takes to make sure that every Australian can survive.
Steve, is it just dividend payments or is it also share prices? Are you prepared to see your portfolio slashed by 90%?
David, at this time, if I'm going to be in it with every other Australian, then I'm not going to have my half foot in and my half foot out. I'm going to be all in. If we're going to get through this, in the words, together, then I'm prepared to take a freeze on whatever my investment is from the bank if it helps a person stay in a house, a mum and dad investor, say a nurse, two nurses who've got one investment property who are now wondering, goodness me, if the domino effect falls, I fall with it.
Yep.
The bank,
Let's come back to the sentiment of we're all in this together. I actually just want to hear from Graham and Lyle on the first question, and that is, when do we get out of this? How do we get out of this? Has anybody heard any metric or trigger point at which the government has said we're going to end this?
Look, it's one of the metaphors that's sometimes true about this is the metaphor of war. And in World War I, young men went off from Australia thinking it was going to last 3 to 6 months. And it lasted, obviously, for 4 years. When you got into World War II, who would have known how long it was going to last? So these are contingent situations where you can't actually plan. You don't have enough knowledge to know when things are going to end. There's a couple of real-life experiments going on, more than a couple. In fact, we're one of the real-life experiments. Every country is a real-life experiment in this. You've got Sweden and the Netherlands, and I'm following them fairly closely, who have left pretty much everything open. And they've got quite a high death rate at the moment, not necessarily the highest in the world, but pretty high. They're working on the herd immunity theory, which I think is probably more certain than the vaccine theory, with all due respect to Steve, in that we know a bit about coronaviruses, and I might back to run out in a second, guys. We know that immunity does build up, so it's a reasonable assumption it will in this case. So they're trying to get it over and done with. You've got other countries like Korea, which is pretty much, again, open for business, but it's managed to suppress it with some fairly strict measures, but I don't think it's included closing schools and so on. And then, you've got countries like us. So on the one hand, you've got the herd immunity argument. Maybe that'll cut in, and maybe we'll be able to go back to work sooner rather than later. Or you've got the suppression argument, and that might lead to just continuous outbreaks and continuous lockdowns, which I think would be absolutely disastrous. And the other thing you've got to take into account is all these young people who are getting thrown on the unemployment scrap heap and how long they're actually going to be prepared to put up with it. Yeah. I think you might find that there's an increasing tolerance to the risk of some older person's life, and I think I'm probably the oldest person in this group. I'm in a slightly higher risk bracket for a couple of reasons, and I can understand that. And at the end of the day, people my age, and certainly people in their 70s and 80s, have had a pretty good run, and I could see it being a very compelling argument that, look, let's just open up again, and if Granny has to go, that's just the way it's got to be. And politicians, being contingent animals, will be sensing those sorts of arguments in the community and those trends and tides, and I think you'll find it open up.
Lyle, is there a way that we can get back into work and reopen the economy without recklessly risking Granny, as Graham put it to us?
Yeah, this is my great hope, and I don't claim expertise here. I'm following this like everyone else, but I think we can't wait for a vaccine. I agree with Steve, that's the optimum, but I don't think we can wait that long. I think we're going to run out of government money very quickly, and the economy is going to have very bad damage done to it, which, as we were saying earlier, that damages all of us as people. So I think we need to urgently find a way as quickly as possible after Easter to end the lockdown, perhaps gradually. I think what we have achieved very successfully is that we have avoided the run on the hospitals and our hospitals becoming overwhelmed. I think big tick to all Australians for the way they've complied with the social distancing and the measures that have been taken. But I think now we've got to find a way to ease the lockdown and then start to protect granny. So let's lock down the older people, and I don't want to accept that we have to have deaths of older people unnecessarily, but let's find a way to lock them down, and I mean that in the nicest possible way, to protect them, and then allow the rest of the population to develop this herd immunity until we can find some sort of a vaccine.
Yeah. Okay, now Steve, you were talking about we're all in this together. Continue on those thoughts.
Yeah, so we're taking that back in mind. So who's in it together? Some or all? The most pressing cry that you hear from people is they're concerned about they've lost their jobs, they've lost their hours, they might have some form of employment, and of course the bills haven't stopped. So how do they go onto JobKeeper, JobSeeker, and literally get their head above water, or do they slowly drown? Now the banks will never lose out of this. It's impossible for them to lose out of this. They will not lose. But what they can do is, if they're virtuous and not virtue signalling, they can be in it together with the country. We can all put a stop, but it's by choice whether we do put a stop to having payments made to our banking system. They will have their own reasoning to never want to have this happen, and that's their vested interest. And I get that, being pragmatic. But if we are truly all in this together, we are either in it all together, where there's no winner and there's no loser. There's just everybody losing collectively, and we hit the pause, stop button, and then when we're out of it, we start going on the treadmill, going back to how it was. When you are getting an interest and principal interest only loan deferred for 6 months, they won't tell you that they're going to keep capitalising the interest. So whilst they're giving you capitalised, so they're not going to give you a holiday. Really, they're going to give you another 2 years of.
So they're not really losing anything.
They're actually making money, because they've now added about 2 years and 4 months on top of your loan. So what you were going to pay off by time X is now time X plus 2 years, 5 months. So a little bit of a haircut for them now is actually a long-term good compounding gain back for them. But as Lyle mentioned earlier, you'd have to be concerned with Australians' mental health and the exasperation and the fear that mum and dads are going home today, Thursday, next week, and the month after, about here come the bills, and here come the bills again, and I've used up what I've got, and I've got nothing left in the tank to fire to pay these bills. So how much of this are we really in it together? I take my hat off to every effort that's being made, but I'd like to see the banking sector actually be virtuous, and people could laugh at that, rather than what they've done sometimes in the past, to virtual signal. Now, this is their time to actually talk the talk and actually be virtuous and not a signal. It's up to them if they want to accept what the community would like to see happen, because they're under the pressure, the community. The community's under immense pressure. It's mental health, under immense pressure, relationships. What's the social cost of having families and partnerships disintegrate? Is it worth the balance sheet of shareholders like me? Well, I'm one shareholder, but I'm prepared to take a lick for the betterment of the country, because that's what we're doing. I thought we were doing this together.
I want to, I guess, pick up on that, because it doesn't feel like we're all in this together. It feels like there's some people who are completely unaffected and yet still a drain on the public purse. So, there's 5 million small business owners in Australia, and a very large number of those, maybe even a significant majority of those right now, feeling the pain. They're having to, speaking to a business owner yesterday who's had to have a really tough meeting with his team, his staff, and he had to tell 4 people that they were not able to stay on anymore because it was just unsustainable, and the rest of them had to switch to more flexible compensation schemes, contracts and the such, like, with a plan to return them, and you try and handle it as positively as you can, but there's small businesses that have had to shut. There's takeaway cafes and cinemas, and in all the supply industries which are related to the airline, for example, taxi drivers and limo drivers, airport transfers. A lot of these people are sole traders, just all by themselves, and they've seen a 90 to 100% reduction in their business in many cases. But then we've got the public sector, and at the best of times, there's fair comment and debate that we have too many layers of bureaucracy and public servants. In Queensland, we saw a huge reduction in the public sector, and then it's come. Not only did the returning Labor government rehire all of those people, but then they grew the public sector from what was bloated, then rationalised to beyond what it was bloated again to what is it, Graham? 30% extra than what it was prior to Campbell. Graham, I can hear your. Can you hear me, Graham? And we can hear your puppy dog. At any rate, my point is that surely the public sector should either be trimming itself in some way, finding efficiencies, but it doesn't seem like that's on the table at the moment. We see public servants getting pay rises, politicians getting pay rises, and as Steve's saying, there's also some elements of the private sector which don't seem to be expected to bear any cost of this, and yet we're being told we're all in this together.
I think, Dave, if this goes on any longer, that social discontentment between the haves and the have-nots in this crisis, the feeling of the rhetoric being we're all in this together, but the reality, if you're on a good government wage, you're not in this together because you're secure. Look, in fairness to the politicians, Scott Morrison has said the federal politicians won't take any pay rises. They've got a pay freeze during this period. Daniel Andrews in Victoria allowed a pay rise for politicians there. Here in Queensland, the Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk and the Treasurer Jackie Trad were about to grant a 2.3% pay rise to all public servants, and only backflipped after the public outcry. So some inconsistencies there. But I think if this crisis goes on, I think you could well see resentment developing in the community between those losing their jobs and those who are on public sector wages. Now, I don't begrudge people working for the public sector. We need a good public sector. We certainly need firefighters and teachers and nurses and the like, and we do need public servants. But the reality is those people, on the whole, are going to be looked after, and that's good. We want people to be looked after, but a lot of people are going to be doing it tough, and there is certainly potential for them and us to develop. And that's why we've got to get out of this crisis as quickly as possible and get things functioning again. And that goes back to the points we were making earlier.
Graham, any thoughts on what you've heard as you've come and gone with laptop power and puppy problems?
Puppy power.
You're just really quiet right now. We need to get a bit more volume from you if we can.
Hang on. I'll sit a bit closer. Look, part of me wants to get angry and say, they all ought to have a pay cut. But in reality, if you've got a job and you're doing it, you ought to get paid to do it. You know, our aim oughtn't to be to punish those people who are in work. Our aim ought to be to get those people who are out of work back into work.
Well, that's an easy statement to say, but we're being told that we're all in this together. I mean, everybody is doing a job and deserves to be paid for it, but, you know, that's not the reality.
Well, a lot of people are still working. It's not as though the whole economy's closed down. A significant proportion of it has, but a lot of people are still working and getting paid good money to work. You can't just kind of arbitrarily say, well, we'll lop off the part of the economy that's still working because half the economy isn't working. That'll give you, instead of half an economy working, only a quarter of an economy working. I don't see how that's in anyone's interests. So, you know, while it's easy to get worked up about it, I don't think you can do anything about it, except that if I were a politician, I'd be symbolically, I think, giving a substantial proportion of my income to charity, saying, look, I'm making these decisions. I understand it hurts. And while I don't propose to work for nothing for the time being, I'm prepared to make this commitment. Another thing I think that they could do is sit. You know, we've got the Queensland State Parliament that's decided that maybe it shouldn't sit till October because it's too dangerous. Well, that doesn't win any brownie points with me. They could do what we're doing remotely.
Yep.
The technology's there. They can call divisions and vote online if they want to. It wouldn't be very difficult to set up and set it up securely enough that you wouldn't have any risk of being hacked.
Yep.
So, you know, I think there's more they could be doing than they're doing, but lopping the whole public sector's pay, I think that wouldn't get you anywhere. It'd do more economic damage than it would do social good.
Well, there's surely going to be a middle ground. I mean, I'm not suggesting radical things, but you know, there is plenty of scope to rationalise and economise the public sector. I mean,
that's a different question.
But it's a different question, but it's also a timely question because we have this now massive public debt that has to be serviced. The budget has to be considered more aggressively than it ever has been before. It's foolish, completely foolish for the public, the average voter, to think there's not going to be a reduction in services correspondent with this economic global health crisis, to expect to have all the government services, all the prosperity, all the wealth and luxuries that the government has provided us in the good times to be consistently sustainable through these extreme times. Surely that's a pipe dream that any competent politician could sell and say it's time to what's the Greek word where they had to tighten the belt in the Greek economy? Not a Greek word, but the word that was used in the Greek. It's time for whatever the word is. We all need to live frugally, and there's just going to be huge reductions in the public service, public sector, public services.
Look, I don't have an argument with you if you say the public service is too large. But now's not the time when anyone's got the ability to tackle it. And I'd also say that public servants are too well paid in that there used to be a trade-off between the security of the public servant, what they got paid, and that's disappeared. And you've now got public servants being paid more than people in insecure private sector, relatively insecure private sector jobs. I think that's wrong.
Yeah.
So there's a couple of things to correct, but I don't think you're going to get away with correcting it now. And you have to be very careful in how you correct it. As Campbell Newman proved, just being on the right side of the economic argument, if you prosecute your execution of your correction poorly, you end up losing. And there's no point in that either. So
the word I was looking for, sorry, was austerity. Now's the time to be introducing austerity, and I think the public service is the perfect place to start.
You'd just be pulling money out of the economy,
But that's
shareholders of banks like Steve.
You're pretty much taking the Labor side of the argument. Sorry to be partisan. I try to not be and just be objective, but that is the side of the argument that I guess Anna Bligh and Anastasia Palaszczuk argued, is that let's fabricate a third increase in the public sector because it'll give people jobs and put money in the economy. It's like, yeah,
no, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying now would not be the time to run around doing that. And, you know, you're picking on the public service because they're still fully employed, but there's a whole lot of other people who are still fully employed. I mean, I imagine if you're a technician in the telecoms industry, you're pretty fully employed at the moment.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people still doing web design and programming and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, who are still fully employed. Should they be sharing the pain? Should they be going and buying takeouts at their local restaurant, which used to be sit down and try to keep...
I think if the free market justifies them, I'm definitely a free market devotee, not that it's perfect, but if the free market justifies keeping them on or paying them extravagantly, then that ultimately is going to be something that the free market will find the best efficiency for. So, you know, we don't need... See, the free market provides real services and real products, unlike the government, which doesn't really make anything. But, you know, if you have checkout, people stocking the shelves at supermarkets right now are a valuable service, much more than they were in 2019.
Well, so you can't see how, in light of our conversation about the Chinese government and how bad it is, you can say that our government doesn't provide a valuable good to us. It does. It doesn't necessarily do it as efficiently as it could. It provides some things to us as goods which it doesn't need to and which other people could. But ultimately, government is a necessity.
Oh, yeah, I'm not saying abandon all government. Look, little quick question. This might be a cheap shot, but it's probably an easy and fair one. Those who are still employed, no, that wasn't the one I was looking for. Where was it? Here we go, Eli. One question I have, was it really necessary to increase the welfare payments for people who were already not working? It's not like they lost their businesses or jobs. Donna Hawkins suggests the answer. They increase the welfare payments because those people go out and spend, except they have nowhere to go spend it all. So different question. Yeah, why was the job seeker payment increased? Anybody?
It's a good question. I think possibly the better question would have been, why do pensioners get an extra payment? But the job seeker allowance is meant to be temporary, and I think the government could justify increasing it on the basis of it's not going to be temporary for a while now because there's not much point for most of those people going looking for a job. And they probably also wanted to give extra money to people who were losing a job who had reasonable expectations of being able to keep it. But I think the problem's going to be when we're out of this, winding it back, because there was a fair bit of pressure on to increase it. And I'd have to say, I don't know anyone who could live on, I don't know anyone, even one of my early 20s kids who could live on that living at home. So, you know, it was a fair question, I think.
Yep. Now, I actually had another tangent. Somebody else jump in with something. Lyle, Steve, any thoughts on what Graham just said?
Just in terms of, I think where you were wanting to go a bit with the conversation about the public service and using the times that we're into to review the size of it and all those legitimate discussions, I think that does take us to policy on the other side of this. And I really think we've got to, yes, by all means, we're going to have to cut our cloth with the size of government for sure. But I think some of the big policy debates that have, I think, been a handbrake on our economy and our ability to go forward as a nation over the last 10 or 15 years have got to be reviewed. And, you know, we've noticed that the in this time of coronavirus crisis. We haven't heard about the other, so-called climate crisis and emergency. That's all gone away as we've sought to survive. Now, I think as we come out of this, we are going to need our economy to fire on all 6 cylinders, all 8 cylinders as quickly as possible. And I think that means we've got to take advantage of the competitive advantage that we have as a nation. And Steve was talking about it earlier. We sit on vast mineral wealth here, underutilised, and with the left of politics trying to drive and demonise the utilisation of those strategic advantages as a nation to try and stop us using those. I think we've got an opportunity now to use our competitive advantage of energy to refire a manufacturing industry that can create jobs and power our economy without the constraints of the green so-called climate emergency. Yes, by all means, let's use clean technology, but let's use the technology. Let's use coal. Let's use nuclear. And let's push the green left out of the way so that we can get our country going again.
Look, and there's another really good point on the uselessness of extreme greens, not only in their overuse and demonstrated now inappropriate use of the word emergency and crisis. So now we also see that what's also useless and perhaps a really good way to help jumpstart the economy and put money naturally back into the market is to radically wind back the huge imposition that the EPA and the environmentalists in bureaucratic positions have put on the global economy, the national economy.
It should never take us 8 years to approve a coal mine again.
Say again, Noel? Lyle? Noel.
Sorry, Dave. Just on your point about green tape, we should never be in a situation again where it takes us 8 years to approve a coal mine, where it takes years to get the necessary approvals for a dam. Things have got to change, and we're seeing what a real crisis is like. We've had fake crises in the past. We need to reform the way we do business in this country and the way we use our resources for the benefit of our nation.
Steve, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, isn't it, in these times, how we all look at how Australia should be, not how Australia was. And Lyle, you've made some interesting points there about the environment, the EPA. But we have to look at what we want to be. And I know I hear the words fairness and equity. And I don't disagree with fairness, and I don't disagree with equity. But I want what's best for this country. Now, that's very, very contestable amongst people. And I agree with that. And contestability of ideas is fantastic. But I'm seeing now a generation of young Australians who maybe this time next year are still not working, regretfully, possibly. I don't want that to happen. When it's April the 8th, 2021, and things are, as when I can remember in 1982 to 87, they weren't great. And you had 240 people applying for a bar glassies job at Friday going back all those years. It wasn't good. Now, people will do what's best for them. And what they will want is employment. And they'll take any employment because they want a job. They want to be productive. They want to be answerable to themselves and say, I'm contributing into my community. And that can be in any capacity, be it a carer for a disabled person, a physicist, teacher aide, a person who fixes and changes tyre at Kmart Auto. This time next year, people will want to be able to go out that front door, contribute to their family, contribute to their community, and also be well mentally for themselves. And they might not luxuriate in what we've luxuriated in the last maybe 10 years. And the environment is critical. But I've never met a farmer who I'm very close to with my community touches who's wanted to destroy their environment. I've never met one yet who's gone out to purposely go and destroy their own farms physically. There's got to be a balance on how we take this country forward. And screaming and yelling over the top of each other to be heard is what I've noticed we've been doing. We do sit on vast assets, Some of them are minerals. Some of them are our peoples, our intelligentsia. It would be nice not to see the brain drain leave Australia and go to Europe and the Americas. It'd be nice to see a tax system that rewards keeping those very, very, intelligent people here at home. It's an opportunity to recast how we have Australia function within itself, how we treat everybody, right through and importantly into our Indigenous communities as well, how we treat the environment, how we look at green tape, how we look at red tape.
Yeah.
I'm noticing the Brisbane City Council, it took a crisis, which this one is, for somehow, somewhere, a Lord Mayor to step up and say, you know what, I don't need to tax you to sit on the footpath and have a cup of coffee with your wife or your partner. You know what, we really don't need that money. So let's suspend the footpath tax. So wasn't it ironic that in times of real emergency, the taxation revenues on stuff could be put aside so business could actually keep going? Isn't it a luxury to have when the economy's going great that you tax these really simple things, but when the economy's on a catastrophic cliff edge, all of a sudden those regulations, which were luxurious, are now actually not important? I think you're actually starting to see what really matters, and what really matters for employment, for anyone who's wanting to be employed, is less regulation that's just not necessary. And Lyle, your comments about green tape, red tape, pink tape, orange tape, the words tape. And we all know what happens when you put tape around something. It restricts it. The moment you cut tape, it lets the blood flow and everything flows again. There's no big thing here. You cut the tape, that lets things grow and flourish. You tape things up, and it's meant to constrict.
Yep. Let's wrap it up. It's been 90 minutes. Final question, which we can take a punt at. No qualified person is in the future just yet. No person on this planet anyway. Let's talk about what Australia looks like on the 8th of October 2020, 6 months from now. What is life like? Do we have sport back? Do we have business back? Are we allowed to go to church again? Steve, let's start with you.
In October this year, it's a crystal ball, isn't it? I'm confident that Australia will be starting to rediscover what it is. It's a bunch of great people. It's probably going to have time to reflect and get closer to its friends and its community and its family. It's probably not going to want the brand new car that it always thought the marketing programs of product X, Y, and Z was pummeling onto it. It might actually have more time to think about what's important to it. But what is important to Australia is its jobs, its family, its friends, its relationships, its peoples, or everybody. And I mean everybody. It also gives us an opportunity to reflect where we stand in Asia Pacific and the world. Are we confident in who we are? Do we have all these resources that we don't actually optimise for our best and best outcomes for our peoples? Are our tax structures that we've always had for so long actually doing the best it can for the country? And if it isn't, who's winning out of these laws? Will it allow the recasting of laws where Australia becomes, as I call it, and I really do look at it quite bluntly, why are we not the Switzerland of Asia Pacific? Why is Switzerland doing so well? Why does Switzerland do so well? It's got
lots of questions, Steve, but what are the answers?
I think it gives us the opportunity, David, to start driving home to look for these answers. It's very rare that a country gets 6 months to hit the pause button and actually start discussing like we have today and with the people who are looking on at the moment. Because it gives us a lot of opportunity to actually, for once, luxuriate in thinking and not trying to make a buck. But unfortunately, we've all got to survive. So 2020, October, I think we'll be back to 4.5 cylinders out of 6. And I'm very hopeful that we will have a trickle up and we'll get to Graham's V8.
Awesome. Lyle, what's Australia look like? What's life like in Australia in 6 months?
I think we have to be back to almost normal by then, and we've got to have measures in place that protect the old, the frail, and the vulnerable that are susceptible to this disease. And the rest of us have got to be back to work. And I think that's what we've got to be aiming for. I think for us to have to be observing this level of social distancing and lockdown in 6 months' time will be disastrous for the nation, unaffordable for the government finances, and will be doing irreparable damage to the economy, and to people's lives. So I think it's got to be, some level of normalcy with protection for the vulnerable.
Yep. And Graham, what do you think? Is there going to be a new normal in? Oh no, I just accidentally removed him. Got you back.
No,
Sorry,
okay.
Graham, pressed the wrong button. Is there going to be a new normal in 6 months?
Look, I think the problem with imagining the future is that what we tend to do is project the current forward. I can't imagine that we're living life as differently as we are now, and that won't change things even when we're out of problems with the virus. I think we'll probably have a more flexible workforce in the sense that people will have got used to working from home. And that'll be a good thing because there'll be less stress on our physical infrastructure. I don't think you'll see the tourism industry kick back very quickly. And I think it'll be a long time before you'll see a lot of international tourists coming to Australia. So there'll be a lot of unemployment amongst young people in those sectors, and it'll also be regional. I wouldn't want to be in Cairns or owning real estate in Cairns or a business in Cairns. I can't see that bouncing back in a real hurry. And that's taking an optimistic view that we'll have got to a position where the disease is under enough control for most of us to go back to work. And I don't know that that's in any way a sensible position. And it also assumes that all the states act in accordance with each other. We're seeing minor variations between states at the moment. I think some of the things that Scott Morrison's announced are things possibly against his better judgment. We won't find out about that for some years because it's not in anyone's interest to let the divisions that are undoubtedly happening behind doors, or at least the arguments, out into the public, lest people panic. But you might find different states going in entirely different positions. I've been surprised at the reassertion of federalism. Who would have thought that the Queensland-New South Wales boundary would have barriers up on it, stopping those people from New South Wales coming up here? So it's going to be a different world. Whether we're able to use this as a pivot to say, look, we need to work out what we care about and we need to get things going in a hurry. And that means cutting a lot of this red tape and this over-complexity. Whether that argument wins or whether people say, look, it worked pretty well without all that extra income. So if you need to make sacrifices for climate change, we know it's going to be worse than COVID-19 was. I'm very bad at predicting which way people will panic.
Yeah,
I thought people would have actually got over the climate change panic by now and realised that China and India were the two countries in control there, and that what we did here had very little effect on it. Yet we've just come through a summer where everyone's convinced it's the first lot of bushfires we've ever had in the history of the country, that when you have a bushfire, somehow it does lasting damage to the country rather than having been part of the history of this country for 60,000 years and more, and then that it's never going to rain again, and then suddenly when it does rain, that's a climate change problem too, like panic, panic, panic. So, predicting that cycle of panic's going to disappear because we've come through a serious panic and a reason to panic, I'm not confident of that. So I'm not sure. What I am confident of is that the fight will go on.
Yep. Very good. I want to thank you all, gentlemen, for your time this afternoon. It's been a fun and entertaining chat with good engagement in the comments section. Hopefully, it's not too long for people to watch back, but there's a few people that have been with us the whole time. You can see articles and recent episodes on my website, davepellowe.com, and that's also the title for all my that's where you can find me on social media, Dave Pellowe. you'll also find Graham Young and Lyle Shelton on Twitter and Facebook. And Steve is yet to maintain a public profile. He's generally behind the scenes and just encouraging and helping there. But as a good mate, I love chatting to him, and I thought you'd enjoy him in the conversation this afternoon as well. So thank you, gentlemen, for your time and thoughts.
Thanks,
Pleasure.
David.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Right.
We will see you later, and we'll see you in the comments section. Bye, everyone.